The Voss Ranch sat at the northern end of the Powder River Basin like something that had decided to be permanent before the land had finished deciding what it wanted to be. 4,000 acres of grass and river frontage, a main house with a wraparound porch that you could see from 2 miles out, 3 barns, a bunkhouse that slept 14, and a reputation that had been built over 20 years into the kind of thing that people in Casper mentioned when they were talking about what was possible in Wyoming if you were the right kind of man with the right kind of nerve. Harlan Voss was considered, by general consensus of the Powder River Basin, to be exactly that kind of man. He was 61 years old, broad and loud, with a white beard and pale blue eyes, and the specific confidence of someone who has been agreed with for so long that disagreement has become genuinely difficult for him to process. He rode his land every morning on a gray stallion and spoke about it the way some men speak about their children, with a possessiveness that was also, underneath, a kind of love, though he would not have used that word. He had built something real here. That was true. What was also true, though considerably less discussed in Casper or anywhere else in the basin, was the precise nature of how it had been built and who had done the building. Cole Briggs had ridden onto the Voss Ranch on a Thursday in late April, with 3 months of the previous job still in his muscles, and a recommendation from a foreman in Colorado, whose name Harlan Voss apparently recognized, because he had hired Cole on the spot, which was not his usual practice. Cole was 32 years old. He was lean and brown from years of outdoor work, with dark eyes that moved efficiently across whatever space he was in, missing very little. He was the kind of man who was good at most things and had not yet found the one thing worth being exceptional at. He had been riding for other men since he was 17. He had worked in Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, and twice in Texas, and he had left each place with his wages and his horse and nothing else attached to him, which was either freedom or failure, depending on how you looked at it and what time of day you were doing the looking. The Voss Ranch paid well, and the work was legitimate, moving cattle, maintaining fence line, managing the seasonal crews that came through during branding and harvest. Cole did the work without complaint and without particular conversation, which suited most of the other hands fine. He had been there 6 weeks before he saw her. He had heard about her before he saw her, which was how it worked in a place that small. The hands mentioned her in the way they mentioned most things about Harlan Voss, sideways, carefully, with the specific economy of men who understood that certain topics had consequences. Harlan's daughter lived in the house, didn't come out much, something wrong with her hand, something about a fire. Cole had filed this information away without particular interest and gone back to work. He saw her for the first time on a Tuesday evening when he came to the main house to return a set of land survey maps that one of the junior hands had left in the bunkhouse. He knocked at the side door, which the hands used, and when no one answered after a reasonable interval, he tried the handle, which was unlocked, and stepped into the mudroom to leave the maps on the shelf where they were kept. The door to the main corridor was ajar. Through it, he could see the edge of the study, a large room lined with shelves of ledgers and maps, a broad oak desk at its center. A lamp was burning on the desk. A woman sat behind it. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was— he registered this in the half-second before he understood he was looking at someone who hadn't heard him come in, striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional arrangement of features and everything to do with the quality of attention she brought to what she was doing. She was writing in a ledger with her right hand, and her left hand, which rested on the desk surface, was visibly scarred, the skin drawn tight from the wrist to the base of the fingers themselves slightly curved permanently. She had a veil on a hook beside the desk that she had apparently removed to work. She had not heard him. He stepped back into the mudroom, set the maps on the shelf, and left the way he had come. He thought about her for the rest of the evening in the particular way you think about something when you're trying not to. He didn't see her again for 2 weeks, and when he did, it was in circumstances that changed the entire geometry of his situation in a single conversation. Harlan Voss called him to the main house on a Friday morning, and Cole went, as you went when Harlan called, without knowing what it was about and without asking in advance. Harlan was on the porch when Cole arrived, standing with his thumbs in his belt and an expression that Cole had learned to read in 6 weeks as the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was now in the process of informing you of it. Harlan said, "Sit down." Cole sat. Harlan said, "I'm going to ask something of you that's outside your usual work, and I'm going to ask it plainly." Cole said he was listening. Harlan said, "I need my daughter married." He said it the way he said most things, as a business proposition, a matter of logistics, something to be arranged. He said that Nora was 26 and that there had been no suitable prospects in the basin and that a married daughter was better for the ranch's standing than an unmarried one, and that Cole was a decent man of demonstrated reliability, and that there was a financial arrangement he was prepared to make that would benefit Cole considerably. Cole was quiet for a moment. He said, "With respect, you're asking me to marry a woman I've barely seen." Harlan said, "You've seen enough." Cole said, "What about what she wants?" Harlan's expression shifted slightly, not quite irritation, but adjacent to it, the expression of a man who considers certain questions beside the point. He said, "Nora is practical. She understands the situation." Cole looked out at the ranch, the barns, the pasture, the distant line of cattle along the river. He thought about 3 months of wages and the Colorado foreman's recommendation and the kind of reputation you built or destroyed in a place like this. He said, "And if I decline?" Harlan said, "Then I expect you'll want to collect what I owe you for the first 6 weeks and ride out today, since I'll need the bunk for a man who's more useful to me." It was said pleasantly. That was the thing about Harlan Voss. The pleasantness never left his voice, regardless of what the words were doing. Cole understood the situation completely. He had nothing. He had 6 weeks of wages and a horse and a recommendation from a Colorado foreman and no land, no stake, nothing that would survive him leaving this place. Harlan was offering him something, though the terms of what he was offering were still unclear enough to be suspicious. He said, "I'll need to speak with her first." Harlan said, "That can be arranged." He said it as if he'd expected this response and had already accounted for it, which Cole suspected he had. Nora Voss received him in the study. She was wearing the veil when he came in, a fine black lace that covered her from the bridge of her nose to her chin, and that she wore, he would learn later, with the specific resignation of someone who has decided that the accommodation is easier than the alternative. She was seated behind the oak desk with her scarred left hand in her lap and her right hand resting on the open ledger she had apparently been working in when he knocked. She did not stand when he entered, and she did not perform any of the social adjustments that people in difficult positions often performed for the benefit of people in easier ones. She looked at him with dark eyes above the veil and waited. He sat in the chair across the desk because there was one there and because standing seemed wrong. He said, "Your father has made me a proposal." She said, "I know." He said, "I wanted to ask you directly whether this is something you're willing to do." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "My father presents things as proposals that are not proposals. I imagine you've noticed that." He said, "I have." She said, "I'm willing. I want you to understand that I'm not under any illusion about what this is. It's an arrangement. You get the stake my father is offering, and I get," she paused, "a different set of circumstances than the current ones." He said, "That's honest." She said, "I find honesty more efficient than the alternative." He looked at her across the desk, the veil, the scarred hand, the ledger, the absolute composure of someone who has been in the room alone with her own situation for long enough to have made a complete peace with it, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was respect, not pity. "Respect," he said. "All right," she said. "There's one condition." He said he was listening. She said, "Whatever arrangement we make between ourselves stays between ourselves. My father manages the ranch as far as anyone outside this house is concerned." He said, "I don't understand." She said, "You will." He left the study with the specific feeling of a man who has agreed to something larger than he understood, which was accurate. The wedding was held on a Saturday in the small Methodist church in Casper, with a minister, Harlan, two ranch hands as witnesses, and Cole standing at the front in his best shirt watching the side door. She came in with her veil and a plain dark dress and the unhurried posture of someone attending a business meeting. She stood beside him, and the minister said the words, and at the appropriate moment, Cole reached up and lifted the veil. He had told himself he was prepared for whatever was there. He was not prepared. The burn scar ran along the left side of her jaw, not disfiguring in the dramatic sense, not the ruin that the town's careful silence had implied, but visible, a ridge of skin from ear to chin that the town had apparently decided was enough to write her off entirely. Above it, her face was... He stood holding the veil and understood that the town had been wrong about everything, not just the scar. Everything. She was looking at him with an expression that was not asking for anything, not his approval, not his reassurance, not the performance of acceptance that she had clearly learned not to expect. She was simply looking at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without flinching, waiting to see what he would do with what he saw. He lowered the veil gently back into place. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You didn't need that." She said, "I know." The minister finished the ceremony. Harlan shook Cole's hand with the satisfaction of a man who has concluded a transaction. Cole looked at his wife across the small church and thought about the ledger on the desk and the condition she had named, and the phrase "you will," and understood he was at the beginning of something he hadn't accounted for. He learned it gradually, the way you learn most true things, not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small observations that eventually reached a weight you couldn't ignore. The first thing he noticed was the hands, not Nora's scarred hand, but the ranch hands, the way they deferred. Not to Harlan, not exactly, or not only. When there was a genuine problem, a sick animal, a disputed boundary, a question about the seasonal crew contracts, they went to Harlan first as protocol demanded, and Harlan listened and gave an answer. And then, if the answer was wrong or incomplete, something would be said quietly to someone, and the correct answer would appear later as if Harlan had reconsidered. Cole watched this happen 3 times before he understood the mechanism. The second thing he noticed was the ledgers. He had been moved into the main house after the wedding, into a room across the corridor from the study, and he was awake early enough most mornings to hear her already working before dawn, the scratch of the pen, the occasional soft sound of pages turning. He had gone in once, early in the second week, to ask about a supply order, and had found her working on what appeared to be a contract document, and had looked at it long enough before she covered it to see that it was a grazing rights negotiation with a neighboring property that Harlan had mentioned at dinner the previous week as something he was handling personally. The third thing, and the thing that made the other 2 irredeemable in their implications, was the conversation he overheard on a Wednesday afternoon, standing outside the study door that was slightly ajar. Harlan inside, speaking to the basin's largest cattle broker, saying the things that men say when they are performing competence for an audience, and then a pause, and then the broker saying, "Harlan, I'll be straight with you. It's your daughter I want to talk to about the Eastern contract terms." And to Harlan saying, after a beat too long, "I'll convey your thoughts." Cole stood in the corridor for a moment and then walked back the way he had come. That evening at dinner, he looked at Nora across the table, and she looked back at him with the same composed expression she always wore, and he understood, with a completeness that left no room for qualification, that she had built this ranch, not contributed to it. Built it. From the grazing contracts, to the seasonal crew arrangements, to the financial negotiations that Harlan performed in public like a man reading from a script he hadn't written. Harlan was the face and the voice and the name on the deed. Nora was everything else. He said nothing at dinner. He thought about the condition she had named. Whatever arrangement we make between ourselves stays between ourselves. She had told him without telling him. She had trusted him with the truth in the only way she could afford to trust anyone. He went to her study after dinner. He knocked. She said, "Come in," and he came in, and she was at the desk with the lamp burning and the ledger open, and she looked up at him with that particular expression. Not quite wariness, but the preparedness of someone who has learned to be ready for what looking at her clearly tends to produce in people. He sat in the chair across the desk. He said, The Eastern grazing contract. She was still for a moment. He said, "Oh, I'm not going to say anything. I want you to know that before anything else." She looked at him. She said, "What do you want?" He said, "Nothing." He said, "I want to understand what I'm actually part of." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the lamp between them flickered once in a draft from somewhere and settled. Then she said, "My father is good at two things. He is good at acquiring land, and he is good at being Harlan Voss, which is itself a skill, the presence, the handshake, the way he enters a room. Those two things built the foundation. Everything built on top of them was built by me." He said, "Since when?" She said, "Since I was 19, since the fire." She said it without particular weight, just as a date, a before and after. He said, "Does he know that you know that he knows?" She almost smiled. She said, "We don't discuss it." He said, "That must be exhausting." She looked at him as if he had said something unexpected, which he had, because most people, he suspected, when confronted with her situation, offered pity or outrage or some combination of both, and he had offered neither. He had offered the accurate word for what her life actually was. She said, "Yes, it is." He said, "All right." He stood up. He said, "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what I heard, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't seen what I've seen, but I'm also not going to do anything about it without talking to you first," she said. "That's a different response than I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "Most men, when they find out." She stopped. He said, "Find out what?" She said, "That they married the ranch and not the rancher." He stood at the door for a moment. He said, "I'm not sure I'd put it that way." He left. He lay awake for a long time in the room across the corridor, listening to the silence of the house and thinking about a woman who had been running 4,000 acres from behind a veil for 7 years and had never once been given credit for a single day of it. He started working differently after that, not dramatically, not in any way that Harlan would notice or that the hands would remark on. But he began, quietly and systematically, to make himself useful in ways that had nothing to do with cattle or fence line. He understood numbers. He had kept his own accounts for years out of necessity, tracking wages and expenses across jobs and states, and he had a natural precision with figures that he had never had occasion to apply to anything significant. He began going to the study in the evenings, initially under the pretext of asking about supply orders and crew schedules, and Nora received these visits with the wariness of someone who has been surprised before and did not intend to be surprised again. But she was also, and he could see this despite the wariness, profoundly, essentially alone with what she was carrying, and the presence of someone who knew the truth and had not weaponized it was something she did not know how to turn away from entirely. They began working in the evenings together. It was never stated as a decision. It simply became the practice, the way things that are right for a situation tend to become practice without requiring announcement. She explained the contract structures and the grazing negotiations and the accounting methodology she had developed over 7 years, and he listened with the attention of someone who understood he was being trusted with something that had no precedent in her experience, and he contributed where he could, a question here, a different way of looking at a number there. And she received these contributions with the intellectual honesty of someone who cared more about getting it right than about being the only one who got it right. He found her, in these evenings, to be the most interesting person he had encountered in 32 years of moving through the world. Not because she was extraordinary in the way that extraordinary people announce themselves, but because she was extraordinary in the way that only becomes visible when you stay in one place long enough to see it, patient, precise, with a dry wit she deployed so sparingly that you weren't sure it had happened until a beat after it did. He was staying in one place. He was not sure when he had decided to do that. He was not sure he had decided. He was increasingly of the opinion that some things happen before you choose them, Harlan noticed. Of course he noticed. Harlan Voss had not built a reputation across 20 years by being unobservant, even if much of what he observed he chose to interpret conveniently. He said nothing for 2 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday morning, he called Cole to the porch again, and the pleasantness was in his voice again, and Cole understood before Harlan had said 3 sentences what the conversation was. Harlan said he had been thinking about the arrangement and that he felt it had perhaps been hasty, and that there were legal grounds, given the brevity of the marriage and the lack of, he paused, consummation documentation upon which it could be set aside without difficulty. He said this as if he were doing Cole a favor. Cole stood on the porch in the morning light and looked out at the 4,000 acres and thought about the 7 years and the ledgers and the contract with the Eastern broker and the woman in the study who had been handed the word crippled by a town that had no idea what it was looking at. He said, "I appreciate the thought." He said, "I'm not interested." Harlan's pleasantness adjusted slightly at the edges. He said, "I'm not sure you understand your position here, Cole." Cole said, "I understand it clearly." He said, "I work for you and I live on your property and the marriage was arranged at your instruction." He said, "I also know every contract negotiation for the past 7 years, every grazing rights agreement, every seasonal crew arrangement, and every financial decision that kept this ranch solvent through the dry year of '82 and the beef price collapse of '83. Harlan was very still. Cole said, "I'm not going to do anything with that information. I want to be clear about that. But I'm also not going to set aside the marriage, and I'm going to keep working here for as long as Nora wants me here, and the terms of what happens in this house are going to be decided by her and me, and not by you." He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without performance, with the specific tone of someone who has made a decision they intend to keep. Harlan looked at him for a long time. The pleasantness was gone entirely now, which was, Cole thought, actually an improvement. The real face was easier to navigate than the performed one. Then Harlan went inside and closed the door, and Cole stood on the porch for a while in the morning light, looking at the land, feeling the particular sensation of a man who has staked something for the first time and found it does not feel the way he expected. It felt quieter, more solid, like something you could stand on. She knew about the conversation by that evening. In a house that size, with those two people, information moved efficiently. She came to find him in the barn where he was working on a harness after dinner, which was itself unusual enough that he set the harness down and waited. She stood in the barn doorway with the lamp behind her from the corridor and said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "He could make things very difficult for you." He said, "He could try." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why?" He looked at the harness in his hands. He said, "Because it was the right thing, and because I was tired of riding for other men's stakes." He said, "And because 7 years is too long for something that significant to go unnamed." She stood in the doorway for a while, and he could not see her expression clearly in the lamplight. Then she said, "I took the veil off this morning." He was still. She said, "In the house." "I'm keeping it off in the house," he said. "Good." She said goodnight and went back inside, and he sat in the barn for a while with the harness and the lamplight and the sounds of the horses in their stalls, and felt something he had not felt in 32 years of moving through the world, the specific, grounded, unmistakable sensation of being somewhere he intended to stay. He had ridden into 17 different towns in 15 years, and had left every one of them without looking back, not from callousness, but from the simple fact that nothing in any of them had asked him to stay in a way he could hear. This was different. This was not an ask. It was something quieter and more durable than an ask. It was the accumulation of evenings in a lamplit study and conversations that went somewhere real, and the particular sound of a pen moving across paper in the dark before dawn, which he had come to understand, was the sound of someone doing the work that kept everything standing. He did not want to leave that sound behind. He did not want to leave her behind, which was the simpler and more accurate way of saying it, and he sat with the accuracy of it in the barn until the horses had settled completely and the night had gone fully dark, and there was nothing left to do but go inside and sleep and wake up the next morning and stay. He did not leave. The weeks that followed the porch conversation settled into something he had not expected. Not tension, not the anticipatory quiet of a situation waiting to detonate, but a strange and functional peace. Harlan was present at meals and present at the morning ride and present at the visible performative work of being Harlan Voss, and Cole was present beside him, and Nora was present in the study and in the evenings and increasingly, gradually, in the small, unremarkable moments of the day that accumulate into a life without announcing themselves. She began leaving the study door open in the afternoons. It was a small thing. He noticed it the first time and said nothing, and noticed it every time after that and continued saying nothing, because some things are said more clearly by not being said. He found himself adjusting the rhythm of his days around the open door, not standing in it, not interrupting, but aware of it, aware of her, the way you become aware of a fire in a room, not because you are looking at it, but because the quality of the light has changed. She had a habit of reading at the window in the late afternoon when the work was done, not ranch documents, but actual books, a small stack of them on the corner of the desk that he had not noticed at first, spines worn from use. He asked her once what she was reading, and she had told him, and then, without particular ceremony, had described what the book was about in 3 sentences that made him want to read it himself, which he had not expected. He borrowed it when she was finished. She did not comment on this. He left it on the desk when he was done with a single sentence written on a slip of paper that said, "You were right about the ending." She had left a slip on his windowsill the following morning that said, "I usually am." He had kept it. He could not have explained why. In the evenings, the study had become, without any formal declaration, a shared space. Her at the desk with the ledger, and him in the chair with whatever she had handed him to look at, the lamp between them, the house quiet around them. They talked about the ranch, and about the contracts, and about the things that needed doing. And sometimes they talked about other things, about where he had worked before, and why he had left, about what she remembered of her mother who had died when she was 11, about the fire, which she described once, briefly, with the specificity of someone who has told the story to themselves so many times it has become manageable, which is the closest most people get to being over something. He listened without offering the things people usually offered. She noticed this and did not comment on it, and he suspected she was grateful for it in the way that people are grateful for things they did not know they needed until they received them. One evening in late October, she had fallen asleep in the chair by the window while he was working at the desk, the book open in her lap and her head tilted against the high back, the veil on its hook where she left it now every evening without thought, her face unguarded in sleep in a way it never quite was when she was awake. He had put the lamp down low and left the study quietly and had stood in the corridor for a moment thinking about nothing in particular, which was itself unusual enough to notice. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and was honest with himself the way he had learned to be honest with himself over 32 years of no one else to be honest with, and the thing he was honest about was simple enough. He had stopped wanting to leave. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to, which was different from every other place he had ever been, and he knew it, and he lay with that knowledge in the dark until it settled into something he could carry. In the spring, he registered as co-manager of the Voss Ranch at the county land office, with Nora's name listed beside his as equal partner, the first time her name had appeared on any official document related to the property she had spent 7 years building. Harlan Voss said nothing about it. He had, in the weeks following the porch conversation, recalibrated in the way that men who are genuinely intelligent eventually recalibrate when the alternative is losing everything, quietly, without announcement, adjusting his understanding of what the situation now was. The basin continued to speak of the Voss Ranch as Harlan's. Cole and Nora did not correct this. They did not need to. They knew what they had built, and they knew who had built it. And in the evenings in the study with the lamp burning between them and the ledgers open and the contracts spread across the oak desk, there was a quality to the silence that had nothing to do with the absence of words and everything to do with two people who had found in each other the particular and irreplaceable thing that makes staying somewhere feel like a choice rather than a defeat. Cole Briggs had ridden for other men's stakes his entire adult life. He had left every place he had ever worked with his wages and his horse and nothing else. He did not leave this time. He stayed, which for a man like him was the loudest and most permanent thing he had ever said, and Nora Voss, who had learned not to expect to be seen, found herself seen completely, and found that it did not feel the way she had always imagined it would feel. It felt quieter than that, more like something you could stand on, more like ground.